The first time the lion appeared beside the funeral road, nobody cried out. Grief had already taken the sound from the procession. 3 vehicles moved slowly through the red dust, their headlights pale. In the late afternoon glare, their windows rolled up against the heat. Behind them came an old pickup, carrying flowers wrapped in white cloth. Beyond the road, acacia shadows stretched thin across the grass, and the cemetery ridge rose ahead, like a line drawn between the living and the dead. Then the lion stepped out of the golden grass. He did not charge, he did not roar, he simply walked. A broad-shouldered male with a dusty mane and one torn ear moved parallel to the road, no more than 40 yards away, his paws silent in the dry grass. He kept the same pace as the vehicles, his head low, his tail swinging once, then stilling. The people inside the cars froze with their hands on their laps and their eyes on the windows. At the front of the procession, Thomas Reed pressed his foot down on the brake. He was 61 years old, tall, narrow-shouldered, and known in the settlement as a man who could quiet a room without raising his voice. For 34 years he had served as headmaster of the small school at Mavuno Crossing, a fictional settlement on the edge of the Kalinga Plains Reserve. He had buried parents, former students, neighbors, and his own wife. But nothing in all those years had prepared him to see a lion walking beside a coffin road, as if he belonged to the procession. The driver behind him honked once, sharply, in fear. Thomas lifted a hand but did not turn around. "Stay inside," he said, though only the woman in the passenger seat could hear him. The lion kept walking. Dust lifted around his legs. His mane was not black, like the great territorial males on the reserve posters. It was gold and gray and ragged at the edges. One ear was split near the tip, and there was an old scar above his right eye. He looked neither young nor weak. He looked like something that had survived by not wasting movement. The widow in the second vehicle began to sob. Someone whispered, "It's an omen." Thomas heard the word through an open window, and something in him hardened. There were few words he disliked more than omen. Omen meant people had stopped thinking. Omen meant fear had dressed itself in meaning. The cemetery gate stood only 100 yards ahead. A new metal gate fixed into a long wire fence that had been put up after the settlement expanded the burial ground. Beyond it, the road bent around the ridge and dropped toward the old water track where animals sometimes moved at night. The lion did not look toward the coffin. He did not look toward the mourners. He looked past the vehicles, toward the fence. Then he stopped. The whole procession stopped with him. For several long seconds, the road, the cars, the people, the flowers, and the animal held their positions under the burning sky. Thomas felt the old fear rise in his ribs, the one he had spent years teaching himself to call discipline. It came with a memory he never invited, his younger brother, Nathan's lantern. Swinging in the dark, a shout from somewhere near the thorn scrub, and then the silence that followed. The lion turned his head slightly, not toward Thomas, toward the ridge. Then he moved on, disappearing through the grass where the cemetery fence met a line of weathered wooden posts. No one spoke until he was gone. At the graveside, the prayers were rushed. People kept looking over their shoulders. The widow's hands shook so badly, she dropped a flower into the dust. Children were not present at the burial, but the adults spoke in frightened voices about school routes, livestock pens, and what would happen if the lion came again. By sunset, the story had already changed. The lion had followed the dead. The lion had watched the coffin. The lion had chosen that family. By nightfall, people were saying the funeral road was no longer safe. Thomas Reed stood alone outside the schoolhouse after dark, listening to the wind scrape dust against the tin roof. He had spent his life asking people not to let fear outrun fact. But as he looked toward the cemetery ridge, he could still see the lion's lorn ear moving through the grass, and he could not shake one terrible thought. The animal had not seemed lost. It had seemed interrupted. The second appearance came 4 days later, when there was no funeral. That was the detail Thomas tried not to think about. He was unlocking the schoolhouse at dawn, when the radio on the window sill crackled with a call from Musa Hale, the settlement's livestock coordinator. "Thomas, you need to come to the North Road." Thomas looked across the empty classroom. 22 desks waited in rows. A chalkboard still held yesterday's arithmetic. On the wall beside the door hung an old map of the region, drawn before the reserve boundary had shifted, before the new fence, before the settlement cemetery had expanded up the ridge. He almost ignored the call. Then Musa spoke again, lower this time. "It's him." By the time Thomas reached the North Road, half a dozen adults had gathered beside 2 pickups. Nobody had left the vehicles except Musa, who stood with a rifle held down at his side. He was not aiming it, but the fact that it was visible made Thomas's jaw tighten. Across the road, the male lion stood in the grass. He was farther away this time, near the slope below the cemetery ridge. Morning light touched the rough edges of his mane. Flies circled his muzzle. His torn ear flicked once. He was facing the fence, not the people. "What happened?" Thomas asked. "He came from the west," Musa said. "Walked the road shoulder, same as before. Then stopped there." "Did he approach anyone?" "No." "Did anyone approach him?" Musa's silence answered before his words did. One of the younger men shouted, "Threw a stone. Not close enough to hit." Thomas closed his eyes for half a second. The lion turned his head then, slowly. He looked across the road at the vehicles, and the men inside them stopped speaking. There was no softness in that look, no gratitude, no appeal. It was the look of a wild animal measuring pressure. Then, without hurry, the lion walked along the slope, following the same invisible line he had followed beside the funeral procession. His paws disappeared and reappeared through dry grass. When he reached the new cemetery fences, he paused. Thomas saw it clearly this time. The lion did not stop at the gate. He stopped where the fence turned at an angle and cut across the ridge. He lowered his head. For a moment, Thomas thought he was sniffing the ground. Then the lion lifted one paw and dragged it once through the dust near the bottom wire. Not playfully, not desperately, more like an animal testing an edge he already knew would not give. Musa muttered, "He wants in." Thomas said nothing. Inside him, the old story moved again. Nathan had been the one who cared about tracks. Nathan had been the one who told people the land remembered paths longer than people remembered promises. As boys, he and Thomas had walked behind their father through dry riverbeds, learning which prints belonged to kudu, jackal, hyena, lion. Nathan learned quickly. Thomas learned enough. Years later, Nathan had become a boundary scout for the settlement, the kind of man people called when a broken fence, lost cow, or predator track made everyone else nervous. He was younger than Thomas by 9 years, broad-faced and patient, with a laugh that made people forgive him before he apologized. He had also been the one who warned against building too close to the ridge. Thomas had not forgotten that part. He had buried it. The day the cemetery expansion was approved, Nathan had stood in the schoolhouse with his palms flat on a survey map and said, "That slope is not empty land." Thomas, already headmaster then, already respected, already tired of losing community meetings to fear and rumor, had answered, "It is not a road, Nathan." Nathan had looked at him for a long moment, not for us. 3 months later, Nathan was dead. The official account was simple enough to survive retelling. He had gone out, after dusk, to check reports of livestock movement near the old water track. He had not returned. Searchers found his lantern crushed near a patch of trampled grass. Lion prints were found in the same area. No one needed more details. The settlement decided what it could bear to know. Thomas decided something else. He decided his brother had trusted the wild too much. Now, standing on the road with Musa's rifle visible beside him, Thomas watched the torn-eared lion move along the fence and felt a memory shift under the weight of the present. "Call the reserve office," Musa said. "We need him removed before he hurts someone." Thomas looked at the fence. The lion had already vanished into the grass beyond the bend. "Not yet," Thomas said. Musa turned. "Not yet?" Thomas heard his own authority in his voice before he had fully chosen it. "Not until we know why he keeps taking the same line." Musa stared at him as though age had finally softened his mind. "Thomas," he said, "it is a lion. That is why." But Thomas did not answer, because, for the first time in years, he could hear Nathan's voice more clearly than his own. "Not for us." By the end of the week, the settlement had divided itself into two groups. Those who believed the lion should be driven back into the reserve, and those who believed driving him anywhere was exactly how people got killed. Neither group trusted patience. The third appearance turned argument into pressure. It happened during another funeral procession, this one for an elderly woman named Ruth Bell, who had taught sewing classes under the school veranda for 20 years. The family had requested a morning burial, hoping the lion came only near dusk. He came at 9:30. The road was bright and exposed. Heat had already begun to shimmer over the dry grass. The vehicles moved in a slow line behind the hearse, tires crunching over old gravel. Thomas rode in the front passenger seat of the lead pickup, watching the ridge through the windshield. He saw the grass part before anyone else did. "There," he said quietly. The driver's hands tightened on the wheel. The torn-eared lion emerged below the ridge and began walking parallel to the road. Someone in the third vehicle screamed. A door latch clicked. Thomas turned sharply. "Do not get out." The message moved vehicle to vehicle by shouted warning and frantic gestures. "Stay inside, windows up, no one move." But grief does not always obey instruction, and fear obeys even less. A man near the back, Ruth Bell's nephew, opened his door with a metal groan. He was large, red-eyed, and shaking with the kind of anger that searches for an object. He stepped out, holding a length of pipe. The lion stopped. Thomas was out of the lead pickup before anyone could stop him. "Caleb!" he shouted. The man raised the pipe. "This thing followed my aunt to her grave. It followed the road. It followed us." The lion's tail flicked once. His head lowered. He did not advance, but the air changed. Every person on that road felt it. The shift from strange encounter to possible disaster. Thomas walked slowly toward Caleb, keeping the vehicles between himself and the lion as much as he could. His heartbeat hammered in his throat. He knew enough not to run. He knew enough not to wave his arms. He knew enough to be afraid. "Back into the vehicle," Thomas said. Caleb's face twisted. "You always think a calm voice fixes everything." "No," Thomas said, "but a foolish move can break everything." The lion took one step forward, not toward Caleb exactly, toward the open space the man had created by leaving the line of vehicles. Thomas lifted his hand, palm down, not at the lion but at the people behind him. Inside, now. For a moment nobody moved. Then Ruth Bell's daughter leaned from the second vehicle and cried, "Caleb, please." That did what Thomas's authority could not. Caleb lowered the pipe. He backed toward the open door. He got in. Only when the door closed did the lion move again. He resumed his slow path along the grass, parallel to the road, as if nothing human had mattered except the pressure placed in his way. Thomas stood beside the pickup until the lion reached the fence corner and stopped. Again the same place, again the lowered head, again the brief scrape of paw against dust near the bottom wire. Then the lion moved upslope and disappeared. The funeral continued, but something had changed. People were no longer only frightened of the lion. They were frightened of what their own fear almost caused. That afternoon, the settlement council gathered in the schoolhouse. The room was hotter than the air outside. Dust clung to the window screens. The old regional map hung behind Thomas's desk, curling at one corner. On the tables lay newer maps with clean fence lines and property marks. The new maps made the land look settled. The old map made it look alive. Musa stood first. "We have waited long enough," he said. "This animal is appearing near mourners, near vehicles, near the cemetery. Today a man almost faced it on foot. We cannot risk another incident." A woman named Elsie Grant, who managed the clinic, nodded. "We should request a capture team." "Capture and move him where?" someone asked. "Anywhere away from the road," Musa said. Thomas stood at the back with his arms folded. "If he is moved without understanding why he is there, another lion may use the same route." Musa exhaled sharply. "Now we are making him part of a theory." "No," Thomas said. "He made himself part of a pattern." The room quieted. Thomas walked to the old map and touched the faded line that curved below the cemetery ridge. This was the old water track, before the east borehole failed. Animals moved from the western scrub to the Katala waterhole along this slope. "That was years ago," Musa said. "Dry seasons, remember what committees forget." The words surprised even Thomas. They sounded like Nathan. Musa shook his head. "That corridor was closed for safety after your brother died." At the mention of Nathan, the room changed again. People looked down. Thomas felt heat rise behind his eyes, not grief only, but the anger he had used for years to keep grief standing upright. "Yes," he said. "It was." No one spoke. Thomas turned back to the map. But the fence came later. The new cemetery fence had been built in sections. First the gate, then the eastern boundary, then the angled corner below the ridge where the lion kept stopping. It was meant to keep livestock from wandering through graves and to keep hyenas from digging near the burial ground. It had been approved quickly, with donations from families who wanted dignity for their dead. No one had asked what moved there before. Thomas had not asked either. He had been too relieved to see a barrier between the settlement and the place where Nathan died. That evening, after the council voted to request outside help, if the lion appeared again, Thomas stayed alone in the schoolhouse. He took the old map down from the wall and laid it across his desk. There were pencil marks in the lower margin. He leaned closer. Not his handwriting, Nathan's. The marks were faint, almost rubbed away by years of dust and handling. Small arrows followed the ridge below the cemetery. Beside them were 3 words: "Dry season crossing." Thomas sat down slowly. Outside, the last light burned copper against the windows. For 16 years, he had remembered Nathan's warning as a younger brother's stubborn opinion. Now he was looking at proof that Nathan had seen the pattern long before the fence was built, long before fear turned the slope into a boundary. Thomas touched the pencil marks. Then the radio crackled. Musa's voice came through rough with static. "Thomas, he's back." This time the lion was not beside the funeral road. That was the first crack in the story everyone had agreed to believe. There was no procession, no coffin, no gathered mourners. The cemetery gate was locked, the road empty, and the settlement lights still a mile away. The lion stood under a pale moon near the fence corner, exactly where the ridge bent toward the old water track. Thomas arrived in Musa's pickup, with the old map folded under his arm. Elsie came behind them in the clinic vehicle, carrying a spotlight but keeping it pointed down. Two younger men followed, despite being told not to. One held a phone up as if distance made him safe. "Lights low," Thomas said. Musa gave him a look. "You are not in charge of the lion, no. But I am in charge of whether we make fools of ourselves in front of it." That earned no smile, but Musa lowered the headlights. The lion was a shape of muscle and mane in the dimness. He moved along the fence slowly, nose near the ground. Once he pressed close enough that the wire trembled. He did not throw himself against it. He did not panic. He tested, stepped back, paced, stopped, listened. Beyond the fence, the ridge dropped toward the old water track. Farther still, out beyond sight, lay the Katala waterhole, one of the last reliable water points in that part of the fictional reserve. Thomas unfolded the map across the hood of the pickup. The paper fluttered in the night wind. Musa glanced down despite himself. "That map is older than half the people in this settlement." "So am I," Thomas said. "It does not mean I am useless." Elsie leaned in. "What are these arrows?" "Nathan's, Musa's." Expression tightened. Thomas pointed to the marked line. "The lion is not following funerals. He is following this contour." One of the young men scoffed. "Then why appear during burials?" "Because we use the same road," Thomas said, "at the same slow pace, with engines, dust, people stopping. We notice him then because we are already afraid." The lion scraped once at the dust beneath the wire. Everyone looked up. The sound was small. That made it worse. Musa said, "Even if you are right, he is still too close." "Yes," Thomas said, "because the fence is too close." No one wanted that sentence to be true. The second proof came from the ground itself. Elsie, careful and pale-faced, pointed her low light along the fence line. In the dust beneath the bottom wire were not one set of tracks, but many. Lion tracks, yes, large and rounded, but also smaller prints, jackal, antelope, hyena, the faint pressed ovals of hooves, the scratch marks of animals turning back. The fence corner was a knot in the landscape. Everything moving along the ridge reached that point and had to choose. Turn toward the road, crowd near the cemetery, or force down into the settlement edge. Thomas felt the old certainty inside him begin to collapse. For years he had thought the fence protected them from the wild. Now, under moonlight, he saw it had also pressed the wild against them. Musa crouched despite himself and studied the ground. "These tracks are not all from tonight," he said. "No. How long?" "Long enough for us to have noticed." The lion moved upslope, then stopped and looked back toward the road. His mane lifted in the night wind. For one strange second, Thomas felt the animal was staring through him, through the years, through every meeting where fear had sounded like wisdom. Then the lion turned and vanished into the grass. But the truth was not complete until the camera showed them what pride would not. 2 nights later, Elsie borrowed 3 motion cameras from a fictional rescue outpost 20 miles south. They placed them at safe distance along the ridge, outside the cemetery boundary, never baiting, never approaching the lion, never trying to lure anything, just watching the land. The first night gave them hyenas moving along the fence and turning toward the road. The second gave them antelope bunching nervously near the blocked corner before scattering back west. The third gave them the torn-eared lion. He appeared at 3:17 in the morning, silver under infrared, moving from west to east, along the exact line Nathan had marked. He reached the fence corner and stopped. Behind him, farther back in the dark, two lionesses paused in the grass. Not close, not dramatic, barely visible, but there. The male tested the fence, moved along it, turned downslope toward the road, then circled back. The lionesses did not follow him onto the road. They waited. The footage lasted 48 seconds. It changed 16 years. Thomas watched it in the schoolhouse with Musa, Elsie, and 3 council members. No one spoke when the screen went dark. Musa rubbed a hand over his face. "That road," he said slowly, "is the only open gap now." Thomas nodded. The funeral road had become a corridor because the real corridor had been blocked. The lion had not been haunting grief. Grief had built a fence across survival. The emotional confirmation came from the place Thomas had avoided most. Nathan's old storage box. It sat in a back room of the schoolhouse beneath stacks of broken chair legs and outdated textbooks. Thomas had kept it there after Nathan's death because taking it home felt too final. Inside were notebooks, a cracked compass, a folded cloth hat, and field pages filled with observations written in Nathan's patient hand. Thomas opened one page and saw the same ridge drawn in pencil. Below it, Nathan had written, "If cemetery expands east, leave open crossing below ridge. Do not force cats toward road." Thomas sat on the floor for a long time. No one saw him cry, and that was probably mercy. He had spent 16 years blaming lions because the alternative was harder. That his brother had not been careless, not foolish, not naive. Nathan had been paying attention. And Thomas, who loved him, had chosen the explanation that hurt less. By morning, Thomas knew what he had to do. The council meeting began badly. People wanted solutions that felt like walls. Higher fencing, armed patrols, more lights, a formal request to remove the lion. The room buzzed with fear wearing the clothing of responsibility. Thomas stood at the front and let them speak. Then he placed Nathan's notebook on the desk. "My brother warned us," he said. The room fell still. "He warned me." That was harder to say. Thomas looked at Musa, then Elsie, then the families who had buried loved ones near the ridge. "I let my grief become certainty. I let certainty become policy. And now an animal is being blamed for using the last path we left open." A man in the back said, "So we do nothing." "No," Thomas said. "We do the harder thing." He turned to the map behind him. "We move part of the fence." The room erupted. Move a cemetery fence? Disturb the boundary? Admit the expansion was flawed? Spend money they did not have? Let lions pass near the dead? Thomas waited. Then he said, "The dead do not need us to trap the living." That quieted them more than shouting would have. Elsie spoke next. "If we open a controlled crossing below the ridge, away from the gate, mark it, and keep vehicles from stopping there, animals may stop using the road." "May," someone said. "Yes," Elsie answered. "Wildlife is not a machine, but pressure follows openings. Right now, we have given them the road." Musa looked at the notebook. He had known Nathan too. Everyone had. At last he said, "If we do this, no one approaches the lion. No one tries to film close. No one feeds anything. No one turns this into a spectacle." Thomas nodded. Agreed. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. The work began before sunrise 2 days later. Not with celebration, not with music, not with speeches, with gloves, wire cutters, fence posts, dust, sweat, and unease. The plan was simple enough to explain and difficult enough to matter. A section of the cemetery boundary below the ridge would be pulled back and reshaped, leaving a marked wildlife crossing along the old contour line. The graves would remain protected. The gate would remain closed. But the hard angled corner that trapped movement against the road would be removed. A temporary barrier would keep people and vehicles away from the crossing. No one would stand there at night. No one would wait for the lion. The road would receive warning signs, speed restrictions, and no stopping markers during dawn and dusk. The settlement would work with the fictional reserve staff to monitor movement from a distance. It was not a perfect solution. That was why it was honest. Thomas worked beside Musa in the heat. Neither man spoke much. The wire fought them. Dust stuck to their necks. Twice, Thomas had to stop and steady his breath. Not because of age alone, but because every post pulled from the ground felt like an old belief being loosened. At midday, Ruth Bell's daughter arrived with water for the workers. She stood near the cemetery gate and looked toward the ridge. "My mother would have hated all this fuss," she said. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow. "She taught half of us to mend things," he said. "Maybe she would understand." The woman smiled faintly, only if the stitching was neat. By late afternoon, the fence line had changed shape. The difference looked small to anyone who did not know what to see. A softened angle, a gap guided away from the road, a corridor marked by posts set back from the ridge instead of across it. But to the land, small openings can be large mercies. The first night, nothing happened. The second night, the cameras showed jackals passing through. The third night, antelope moved along the ridge without spilling onto the road. On the fourth evening, just as the sun lowered behind the acacias and turned the dust gold, Thomas stood beside the school pickup, at a distance approved by the reserve monitors. Musa sat in the driver's seat with the engine off. Elsie watched from another vehicle farther back. No one spoke. The cemetery ridge lay quiet. The new crossing opened below it, plain and unromantic. Just a strip of land allowed to be land again. Then the grass moved. The torn-eared lion came from the west. He appeared slowly, as he always had, not as a performer arriving on cue, but as a wild animal following a route older than anyone watching. His mane caught the last light. His head was low. His body bore the plain authority of hunger, caution, and survival. Thomas felt fear. He was grateful for that. Fear, rightly held, kept people alive. Fear, honestly examined, could become respect. It was only fear denied, fear dressed as hatred, that turned dangerous. The lion approached the place where the fence corner had been. He stopped. For a long moment he stood there, and Thomas could see the memory of the old barrier in the animal's hesitation. Not thought as humans think it, not understanding as people understand, just a body remembering resistance. Then the lion moved through the opened line. No roar, no glance of thanks, no blessing. He crossed below the ridge and continued toward the old water track. Behind him, at a distance, one lioness slipped through the grass. Then another shape moved in the shadows and was gone. Musa exhaled. Thomas had not realized the other man had been holding his breath. "He didn't look at us," Musa said. Thomas watched the lion disappear into the dusk. "No," he said. "That may be the best thing we did." The next funeral at Mavuno Crossing came 3 weeks later. It was for an old farmer named Joseph Lane, who had outlived 2 tractors, 1 flood, and most of his own teeth. The procession moved slowly along the road in the pale morning sun. People were still nervous. They would be for a long time. Trust does not return just because a fence moves. But no lion walked beside them. At the cemetery, Thomas stood at the back of the gathering. He listened to the prayers. He watched dust lift around people's shoes. He saw the softened fence line below the ridge and the marked crossing beyond it. For the first time in 16 years, he did not imagine Nathan's final night as only a warning against the wild. He imagined his brother kneeling by tracks, lantern low, trying to understand pressure before it became tragedy. After the burial, Thomas walked alone to the edge of the cemetery fence. Not beyond it, not toward the crossing, just far enough to see the ridge. He took Nathan's field notebook from his coat pocket. He had carried it for days without knowing why. Musa came up behind him. "You planning to keep that old thing?" Thomas looked down at the worn cover. "Yes," he said, "but not in a box. The school changed after that. Not dramatically, not in ways outsiders would notice. But the old map returned to the classroom wall beside the new one. Thomas began teaching the older students how to read both roads and rivers, fences and corridors, settlements and tracks. He did not teach them to love lions. Love was too careless a word if it made people forget teeth, hunger, and distance. He taught them to respect what they did not control. He taught them that a boundary drawn for humans was still a question for every creature that met it. And sometimes, when the evening wind came through the schoolhouse windows and rattled the papers on his desk, Thomas would look toward the ridge and think of the torn-eared lion walking somewhere beyond sight. Not as an omen, not as a messenger, not as forgiveness made flesh, just as a lion, alive because the land still offered a way through. One evening near the end of the dry season, Thomas stayed late to lock the school. The sun was low and the whole savanna seemed made of copper and dust. As he stepped outside, he saw movement on the distant ridge. A male lion stood there, too far away for romance, too far for danger if respected. His mane moved in the wind. One ear looked uneven against the sky. Thomas did not wave. He did not speak. The lion looked over the land below, then turned and moved along the ridge until grass took him from view. Thomas stood with the school keys in his hand and felt something inside him loosen at last. For years he had wanted the world to give him a reason Nathan died. Now he understood that some losses never become fair, no matter how carefully we explain them. But grief can still become useful if it teaches the living to pay attention. Behind him, the schoolhouse waited. Ahead of him, the ridge darkened, and between the two, for the first time in many years, there was a path. Some stories about wild animals are not really about getting closer. Sometimes they are about learning when to step back. The torn-eared lion of this fictional story did not come to comfort a village. He did not follow funerals because he understood human grief. He was moving through a landscape shaped by thirst, memory, pressure, and survival. The meaning came from what people finally learned to see. Thomas Reed's mistake was not fear. Fear around a lion is natural. His mistake was letting fear harden into certainty before the truth had room to speak. That is one of the quiet lessons the wild can teach us. Compassion is not always touching, feeding, rescuing, or claiming a bond. Sometimes, compassion means setting better boundaries, leaving corridors open, listening to the land, and respecting a powerful animal enough not to make it part of our own story. Wild lions belong to the wild. They deserve distance, caution, and protection from the problems humans create without noticing. And maybe that is why this encounter stays in the heart. Not because a lion became gentle, but because people became humble. What do you think Thomas really had to forgive? The lion, his brother, or himself? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if stories about wildlife, compassion, and the fragile line between fear and respect matter to you, consider subscribing for more cinematic savanna stories.